Internet, meet Grimer, my sourdough starter. A lot of people name their sourdough starters because it kind of is like taking care of a pet. You have to maintain it. It's just like naming your car. It's just a fun little thing to do. So I, like a lot of people out there, started making sourdough bread in 2020 when there was no yeast because of the pandemic. A bunch of people, including myself, turned to sourdough bread because it does not use yeast as leavening. It uses a naturally occurring yeast bacteria in a mixture of flour and water that produces gas and therefore leavens your bread and makes it rise. It blows my mind how this works and makes bread. Like, it's just so neat to me. I am by no means an expert on sourdough or sourdough starter. I've only been doing it a year. I'm not like a master baker or anything like that, but I have learned some things and I wanted to put them out there for anyone that's looking for a kind of beginner's guide or little tips and advice, that kind of situation. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the equipment for your sourdough starter, what it means to feed your starter, how often you should do it, and how to do it. And then we'll also talk about the feeding schedule. Let's go. All right, let's talk about equipment. There are a few things that I bought at the beginning because I thought that they were gonna work out great, and then I ended up replacing it with something else because I found out that it didn't work ideally like I wanted it to. So maybe this will save you some money buying exactly the thing you want from the very beginning. So the first thing and the most important thing you need for sourdough starter, sourdough baking in general, is a scale. Please just get a scale. I cannot stress enough how important a scale is for any baking, especially sourdough. I use this way more than I thought I would all the time, and for cooking as well. And it was very cheap. This one in particular was $10 on Amazon. So if you're looking for a cheap option, just do it. The next thing to decide is what you're going to keep your sourdough starter in. And there's a couple considerations to help you determine what kind of container. One, like, it needs to have some room to grow. So after you feed your sourdough starter, it's gonna be pretty low in the container, very small, but then over time, it's going to bubble up and start growing. So if you put it in a container that's not big enough, it will kind of overflow out of that container like this. The other thing that I would suggest thinking about is finding a container that has a wide top so that you can get in and stir and feed your sourdough starter easily. When I first started, I used this container. I don't use it anymore for a few reasons. The number one reason I stopped keeping it in here is because of the lid. Because the lid is attached to the container itself, which makes it really kind of difficult for me to feed it, because while I'm trying to scoop it out and stir it and everything, I have this like dangling glass lid that's just attached that I have to keep track of. The other thing is it ended up being too big. It's easy enough for me to pick this up with one hand, but it's pretty wide. When it's full of sourdough starter and I'm like over the trash can while I'm feeding it and stuff, I feel like I don't have a good grip on it, and there's been plenty of times where it just slips out of my hand and drops in, the whole thing drops into the trash can. It just ended up being too big. Like, it doesn't need this much room. This is a very large jar and it's kind of unnecessary. So I decided to kind of go back and find something else. And what I found were these rec jars. I have a set of 3 of these that came in different sizes, one larger, this is the medium size, and then a smaller size. If you Google search or Amazon search like sourdough starter containers or jars, these rec jars will probably come up, or rec jars of different shapes. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason they're so popular for sourdough starter like containers. And I totally see why now, and I should have just started out with these. So that's my suggestion to you, just start with these. These little tabs pop off and then the lid comes off so that you can very easily get in there and feed your sourdough starter. And this is a better size. It leaves enough room for it to grow, but it's not so big that it's hard for me to handle. It feels very easy for me to grab a hold of. I don't feel like it's gonna like go over into the trash can like I did with this one. This one is a lot heavier too, so that probably contributes to me not being able to feel like I can have a hold of it. But this one it's the perfect size. So I've been using this one and it's been working out great. And I wish I would have started with this from the beginning. The other thing to note about the container that you choose is if you're going with these types of jars, see, I have this like rubber gasket on this one because this one right now is just holding my yeast. So this gasket part makes it airtight and that's fine for my yeast. But for your sourdough starter, you'll want to remove this and not use it. This set does come with a gasket for each size, but you notice I don't have it on because as your sourdough starter grows, it's letting off gas and growing, and it continues letting off gas and letting off gas and letting off gas. It is possible for it to grow too much and just shatter your container if there's nowhere for the air to escape. So you do not want a airtight container. The other thing that I kind of changed as I moved along in my sourdough experience was the spatula that I used. When I started, I bought this jar and I bought a set of these little tiny spatulas. And I would recommend sticking with a rubber spatula, not like a spoon or a whisk or other things that you normally used to stir with. I would really recommend a rubber spatula because it allows you to scrape down the sides of the container and like get underneath and make sure that all of the flour is hydrated. However, this is too small. It's okay for this container, but like you can see the handle is only this big. So I'm putting like my whole hand into the container and it gets all messy. It's okay, but it's not my favorite. And especially when I was first using this one, the spatula is as tall as the container. So my whole hand was in there and I might as well have just mixed it with my hands. There's nothing wrong with them, but they're just not ideal for this job. What I ended up getting instead was this much longer spatula that's very skinny. Anything that's really wide will make it harder to stir and get in all those spots and distribute the water, make sure that the flour is hydrated. Because that's the name of the game. When you feed your sourdough starter, all of the flour needs to be hydrated, no dry clumps. This is a great one because it's nice and long. I don't know if it's just from me using it or if it does this naturally, but like the tip of it kind of bends in a little bit. That's like helpful for scooping underneath, like in the bottom, and making sure that that's all stirred up in there. It's really nice. The only thing with this spatula is that they have started to crack a little bit on the end. It's not a huge deal, but that's just a side note. So when people say feed your sourdough starter or they're feeding it or you have to feed it, like what does that mean? So what sourdough starter is a mixture of flour and water with yeast bacteria in it. The yeast bacteria feeds on the flour that you feed it and produces gas that leavens it and makes it bubbly, makes it possible for it to leaven bread. By feeding your sourdough starter, you're really feeding the yeast bacteria more flour, so that they can continue producing gas, so that it continues to be active and you can continue using it for bread. If you don't feed your sourdough starter, what happens is there's nothing for the bacteria to feed on. Over time, it will just go stagnant. You'll see it deflate, there'll be less gas. It'll develop a layer of liquid on the top that's called hooch, and it smells very sour and like alcoholic. So I'll show you the process that I go through for feeding my sourdough starter. The first step is to discard a lot of what's in here actually. If I was making bread from it or making a recipe, I could use what I'm discarding for that recipe, but you kind of want to get rid of a lot of what's in here and then replace it with new so that they can keep feeding. It's kind of like getting rid of the waste. At least that's the way that I think of it. You need a little bit of starter in here to continue the growth. You don't want to discard all of it and start over, but you need more new than there is old. What I do is I just get my spatula and I get in here and I scoop out the majority of it just straight into the trash can, because the other thing that I discovered over this past year is that sourdough starter, when it dries, is like freaking cement. Like if you get it in your kitchen sink or even on dishes, like on this glass or the spatula, like I make sure that I wash these immediately, because as soon as it dries, it is so hard to get off of stuff. You have to like really scrub. Everything that it gets on, just at least rinse it off right away. And I would not leave it in the bottom of your sink or like around the drain or anything like that, because it will clog that stuff right up. So once I've discarded my sourdough starter, this is about the amount that I leave in the jar of established starter. Then I set it on my scale, and all I'm gonna do is add some water and flour to this and then stir it up. My ratio that I have come up with and has worked well for me is 75 grams of water to 100 grams of flour. And there's no, oh, see, I got too much water. That's fine. I'll just pour it back in. It doesn't really matter if you add the flour first or the water, but I usually add the water first and then put the flour on top. There we go. It's not super exact every time I do this. Sometimes it's like 105. Sometimes the water is at like 80. But the main thing that I'm concerned with is the consistency of the starter when I'm done mixing it up. I keep my sourdough starter pretty stiff. What that means is not very much liquid to it. It's more like the consistency of a dough would be. So now I'm gonna stir it up, and all I'm doing, I'm making sure that the flour is really hydrated, because right now you can see that there's all these dry bits. If you leave dry bits, that's no good. You can use a more hydrated starter if you like. It's totally up to you. You can do more water than I'm doing. You can do equal parts water and flour. That's an option. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. You just have to kind of trial and error this part until you find what works best for you. Okay, so that's pretty well stirred up, I think. And it's the consistency of a sticky dough, which is exactly what I want. The flour is hydrated. There's no dry spots. And then all I'm gonna do is put the lid back on, and it's done. More for my own curiosity than anything else, I keep this colored hair tie on the jar so that I can see, like when I'm done feeding my starter, I put it pretty much at the level that it is once I'm done feeding it. That way when I come back later and look at it, I can see how much it's grown from where I fed it. So now that I've shown you how to feed your sourdough starter, the next thing I wanna talk about is how you know when to feed it. How often should I be doing this? When I first started feeding my sourdough starter, I started it with a guide on my own. I didn't buy like starter that was already done and then add to it. In the very beginning, I was feeding it twice a day. Once it was established and healthy and active on a consistent basis, I stopped feeding it twice a day, and instead I would feed it once a day, and then on the weekend I would make bread. I started noticing pretty quickly though that I felt like I was wasting a bunch of flour, because if I'm using 100 grams of flour to feed it every morning and then I'm making one loaf of bread on the weekend, that means for the other 6 days of the week when I'm not making bread, I'm just wasting 100 grams of flour every single day. I wanted to figure out a better way to keep it fed and active and healthy, but not waste so much flour. One of the things that I noticed immediately when I was feeding my starter and when I was making sourdough bread was how much the temperature affects how active it will be. The yeast bacteria is way more active in a warmer environment. Colder temperatures slow down the bacteria. So you may have already heard of people keeping their sourdough starter in the fridge, and that's the reason, because cold temperatures slow it down. So if you're like me and you were thinking to yourself, oh man, like I'm feeding this every day and I'm kind of like wasting all this flour, the way that you can slow it down and use less flour and have to feed it less often is to put it in the fridge. If you're going to keep it in the fridge, The only thing to keep in mind is that before you bake with it, take it out of the fridge 1 or 2 days before you intend to bake with it so that you can feed it, it can come up to room temperature, and it can start being bubbly and active and like ready to be baked with. Because if you take it out of the fridge and then you're gonna bake with it, it's gonna be cold, which is gonna slow down the activity of the bacteria. And it's not going to leaven your bread or whatever you're baking as much as it would if it was room temperature or even a little bit warm. So what I do is if I'm intending to bake bread on Saturday, then on Thursday, I take it out of the fridge, I feed it, and I let it sit on the counter at room temperature. And when I feed it, I use warm water to kind of liven it up a little bit. And then on Friday, I feed it again with warm water to really get that activity going. And then it's ready for me to bake with on Saturday. Keeping your sourdough starter in the fridge can kind of turn into a trap though. And I fell into this trap. I put it in the fridge and then like just life happens, you're at work, you're doing whatever hobbies and cleaning, like making other meals and things, and you just forget. And time goes by quicker than you thought it did. And it's been like 3 weeks or a month and you're like, oh, I haven't fed my sourdough starter in like a month. That happened to me and it's not the end of the world. I have even left it in there for 3 months before, and don't do that. That's not what you're supposed to do. But if you do and you forget about it, it's not the end of the world and your starter can still be saved. I left Grimer, poor Grimer, in the fridge for like 2.5 months because I just forgot. If you leave it in your fridge for weeks or months and don't feed it, this is what it looks like. It's not great, let me tell you. It's not an ideal situation, but it can be fixed. And I was able to fix Grimer, I saved him, and he's fine now. It's very hard to completely kill sourdough starter. More often than not, your chances are very good that your sourdough starter is fine. You just need to feed it a few times and then it'll be ready for you to use again. So don't panic. However, sourdough starter can go bad. So if you pull it out of the fridge after not feeding it for a really long period of time like that, and you see any pink or orange in the sourdough starter, that's bad bacteria. So you're gonna have to get rid of it and start over. What you'll most likely see is the same thing that I did, with a nice thick layer of hooch on the top, and it'll probably be gray. And mine was very gray, which is, it looks really bad, but it's okay. You can still fix it. All I did to fix Grimer was take him out of the fridge and start feeding him daily, leaving it at room temperature, and he was totally fine. The other thing that you can do that helps is not only to use warm water to increase the activity, but use a type of flour with a higher protein content, like wheat flour or rye flour. I didn't want to keep a specific flour in the house to feed my sourdough starter, so I just use all-purpose flour, and it's totally fine. So whatever you want to use is up to you. I think that is it. I'll put the link to the perfectloaf.com down below, and also all of the equipment that I talked about in this video, links will be in the description. Next week, I'll actually be showing you how I make my sourdough loaf. Kind of a similar structure for that video too, the equipment that I use and some things that I have learned along the way through trial and error or by accident. There's a lot of things that I feel like, even the really good educational websites where I feel like I gained a lot of knowledge, there's still a lot of things that I learned just through experience and doing it that no one mentioned. So I wanted to share those things. If you like this video or you learned something, give it a like. If you'd like to learn more, subscribe to my channel. I upload every Friday. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!